in finishing up the packet for the teachers, and just talk a little bit about sort of the certificates themselves and how they were to convey value. And so we've got a couple of numbers on here. Are there any numbers in particular that you kind of wanted to highlight while we're here that you think would be of particular importance to the teachers? So why don't you take a couple of numbers, and then we can just kind of go over a couple of those numbers on the certificate
I'll just say that the certificates, over time they've had stock certificates, and really certificates at one point in time were to show that you owned stock in a company, that you had, an equity interest in the company. And now, certificates are done electronically, and as a result, you miss all the steps that people had to go through to get a certificate issued. But these particular certificates were issued in a certain standardized format because the stock exchanges required it. Each stock exchange required every member to have a different border around it. They all had to have unique borders. They all had to have unique vignettes, which is the picture that's on the certificate. They had to show who their transfer agent was, who their registrar was. The registrar is who registers the stock to begin with, transfer agent, when transfers ownership from one person to another. They needed to show what type of stock it was, the type of stock they were buying. But, it was more of a recognition that you bought equity in that company. But as it turned out, people would lose stock certificates, and then they got them replaced. So a lot of times people think because I have a physical stock certificate that was issued in my name or my parents' name or in a relative's name that was endorsed over to me, that it still has equity in that company. And it may have that, but if a company can't get a hold of a shareholder for a certain period of time, they're required to escheat that value of that certificate or the actual stock over to the state where that person lived. And as a result of that, they don't necessarily have ownership anymore in the company because it was turned over to the state, and they have to go to the unclaimed funds of the state to see if the states have any money sitting out there for them. And it's unfortunate because people, and it's evolved over time in this whole process where people would think that if I have that certificate, I stash it away in a safe deposit box, I've endorsed the back of it, I'm giving it to my relative, that they can cash it in. But if they lose contact with the company that issued the certificate, it gets turned over to the state now. And whatever value that you had in that certificate, the states would get those stocks and then they would sell the stock at that point in time. Some states will save the money they sold it for in the state funds, but other states will commingle it with the state funds, which is very unfortunate because if you don't get a hold of the state within a certain period of time, you're out of luck. And people need to know that. So it's evolved of what the certificate represented in the beginning. It was actually a contract, a document, a legal document, and now it's turned into a collectible in a sense because it makes it much more difficult now to have a stock certificate to be able to sell it. If you let's say your stock certificate is still outstanding with the company and you want to sell it, you got to run through a lot of hoops to sell it to. You got to find the transfer agent. You got to contact them. They're going to say, okay, well, send us a certificate. We'll get back to you, make sure it's still on our books and records. And then it takes, it could take a few weeks to be able to sell a stock. Meanwhile, if you bought a stock electronically and you have it in your name on your brokerage account, you can sell it instantaneously through your stockbroker. And that's why they've gone away from issuing stock certificates, is because the paper was so cumbersome and it was, so many steps you had to go through. And so many hands you had to go through to process a transaction. And in fact, during the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, I'm not sure about the 90s, they had to keep all the certificates if it was in the stockbroker's name, they had to store it at the depository transfer
DTCC,
DTCC,
yeah.
And they had to store it there to every transaction. That was their way of keeping a record of it. And then whenever it sold, they had to pull that certificate and then cancel it. Then it would end up in storage. And these certificates that have cancellation marks on it, the transfer agent was required to keep it for 5 years in storage before they can even dispose of it. And a lot of these certificates ended up staying in storage forever, and then they ended up getting in hands of collectors because they found them in old abandoned buildings.
So it's interesting because I think what you're really kind of describing is that these pieces of paper would represented an economic contract between the owner and the company, and as such, you needed to have a legal process, right, to protect property rights. I mean, this represented an ownership stake, and
Yes.
so when you look at, again, sort of it really was more of a function of how laws were conveyed, and over time, as we have, transformed in our society from a more physical contracts to more sort of digital transactions, the physical paper doesn't have nearly as much value, and all the infrastructure that was involved in that physical structure has all been completely dissolved. So now it's infinitely even more cumbersome to transact in the physical world than it is in the digital world. So I think that's interesting. So we'll have to talk a little bit about that,
Sure.
when we go through and we talk a little bit about how technology has changed.
One point that's interesting on these that most people don't know,
Okay.
I'm sure you know, is what it says non-assessable shares. And
What is that?
every stock certificate,
I see this one here.
yeah, they all say non-assessable. And and what assessable is that when stocks were issued early on, they were in the form of a contract that when you bought the shares to invest in this company, if the company wanted to do a capital call and they needed money to survive, you were required, you entered into a contract to contribute money to that company. So, and if they had a capital call or a assessable call to require more capital, people would have to put money in.
Right.
And as a
right.
result of that, they eventually faded that out, and that's why they say non-assessable, to let people know, well, if you're buying stock, you're not required to put money in if we need the money.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's similar to I think it's another core aspect that has changed is the par value. Right. So the par value on the stock typically would represent a fixed quantity of capital, and then the firm would utilize that particular fixed quantity of capital. Over time, par value, that sort of benchmark of par value has basically been whittled down to, in many cases, I think I've even seen certificates that have been issued that say no par equity value. So it's not acknowledging the original contribution that you had in there.
At one time, par value was the amount of money that the company could never touch. They always had to hold on to that amount of money.
Yeah, it was a legal hurdle.
Legal hurdle. And eventually, it just became a meaningless number.
Yeah. What I do think is interesting too is just to kind of further that you were talking about. So when I talk a lot about these documents as economic contracts, one of the most important things is it's called the right of assignment, which basically means that you, as the owner of this contract, right, between you and the company, have the right to assign your ownership interest at any point in time. And so on the very back, if you look at the back of these certificates, you'll see they're all pre-printed on here, and it reads for value received, and then you would identify yourself as the owner of their certificate. You would acknowledge the amount of money that you received for it, and then you were freely, you had the right to freely determine whatever value you wanted. You didn't have to go to an exchange. You could completely do whatever you want of your own accord. And then you would, like I said, so you would sign your name, recognize the value, and then it would be sold. But then the process that was started was that, okay, the old certificate had to be tendered, it had to be canceled, and then a new certificate with a new serial number. Then we get the serial number in the upper left-hand corner that would have to be issued, and then this paper process would kind of start over and over and over again. Anytime anybody ever bought or sold, you would have to record the new owner, issue a new certificate, and there was, like you said, in the 60s, when trading volumes started to get into the tens of millions of shares, a lot of these firms had difficulties meeting the physical delivery. And that's where this DTC is, or DT Depository Trust Corporation, is a lot like the automatic check clearing,
Mm-hmm.
right? So where the banks would send checks instead of sending them individually to each other, they would have a centralized location where all the checks would kind of
Clearinghouse.
clear, exactly, a clearinghouse. And then so this DTC was very similar. So if you were a brokerage member of this DTC, all the things would settle right there, and it was a much easier process. Okay, so one of the things that I also like to talk about when we're talking about these certificates, so I just want to highlight some of the things we talked about. So we talked about the serial number, which was number 2 on the upper left-hand side. You mentioned the registrar, which is the person who is responsible for recording whoever owned the certificate.
You had the corporate seal, you had the officers' printed
Corporate seal.
signatures. They were either hand signed or they could have their printed signatures printed on the stock certificate. They would have the type of stock it was, whether it was capital stock, common stock, preferred stock, restricted stock for that matter. And it's all of these steps somebody had to do. That's the thing about this.
The number, just look at, this piece of paper right here. It was originally issued at some particular point, and you can see we've got the whole bunches on here where it was canceled, and then somebody had to cancel, and it had to be
before they had machines. They had to manually stamp them and cancel them. And
I think
imagine you went to school, you didn't go to school, and then your job was to cancel stock, and all of a sudden the automatic canceller came along. You're out of luck. Replaced by automation.
How do you retrain from something like
That's
that?
right.
It's
tough.
Be warned. Yeah, exactly.
It's a tough world out there.
It is a tough world.
Automation can take over a lot of things.
It's very
and it
quick.
has, and it still does.
It still does, and will continue to, right? It will definitely continue to. One of the other aspects that I like to talk about with these certificates is a little bit with the artwork itself. Because these documents convey economic value, there are some design elements in there that were created specifically to prevent counterfeiting.
And they all had to be unique. And if you look closely at these certificates, they have these little dots on them. And those were like for counterfeit protection. So
Dots?
if you see these little spots here?
Oh,
That was all for counterfeit protection.
Okay, that's interesting. I never noticed that.
It was really funny when I
see
first got into
that's
business and I
interesting.
sold something.
I never knew that.
I
never knew that.
I sold one of these on my website. Somebody called up and she said,
Well, it's dirty.
I'm sending the certificate back. It has mold in it. And I go, what, really? And I'm looking, I go, gee, I guess it does. And I talked to somebody and they go, no, that's counterfeit protection.
All right, so
And then the other thing too, if you look at the certificate, you'll see the holes punched in it. And those were the dates. It was the processor who processed it or what machine they processed it on, and then the date it was canceled. So that's how you find out what the cancellation date. Earlier they were hand stamped, but then again the machines would would process those.
Yeah, we have some. What I'll do is I might be able to, if any of these teachers are interested, I might be able to have access through our digital archives where we can, have, and then we're really talking about the sort of, 19th century certificates that we had the either hand stamp cancellation or they would physically deface the document.
Right, or they cut out the signatures.
They would cut out the signatures, right. I think one of the common ones that I show here, and I'll probably throw it up while we're talking, is the West Shore Railroad. And the West Shore Railroad has, it's the, whatever the...
Chauncey Depew signed it, I think.
Yeah, and I have the certificate where it's, they're defacing the signatures of the... Because the signature is what conveys authority on the document.
Right.
So you need to have some way to sort of disavow that economic interest, and by defacing the document on the signatures, that's how it was done in the physical world.
A lot of those were bonds versus stock certificates too. So a lot of times they would cancel each coupon on the bond to make sure that they couldn't turn them in,
Yeah, I
as
do.
well as the bond itself.
I have that. I need to make sure that I can throw that image up there as well too.
Sure.
I kind of want to just sort of finish up. So was there anything else on here in particular that you had always found interesting in terms of these certificates?
The one big point that I always keep in mind is the tens of thousands of people these companies employed to issue, to distribute, to cancel, to store, all of these certificates. And now it's all been replaced by click.
Yeah.
When you think of it, and that's the really significant thing on paper and these type of certificates, is that you can look through this and read between the lines and see the processes that took place, and now it's all buried in computer code. So the same processes take place now.
Yeah.
They all have counterfeit protection. They all have unique serial numbers. They all have officers, registrar.
Transfer,
they
yeah, exactly, yeah.
The corporate registration, that type of thing. But you don't see them. So this tells a story, and it helps explain the process that each stock, when you purchase them, they all go through.
Yeah.